So it's the time. Good evening, everyone. Yeah. Welcome to the 10th lecture of Innovation in Linguistics by Cognitive Semantics Journal. Today, we have the great honor and pleasure to have Professor Glynn with us. Before we get started, I will invite the editor-in-chief, also the founding editor of Cognitive Semantics, Professor Fuyin Thomas Lee from Beihang University, to say hello to our speaker and our audience.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm very happy to invite our assistant editor, Dr. Liu Na, to introduce the journal and our speaker today. Okay, the microphone is yours, Dr. Liu.
Thank you, Thomas. Cognitive Semantics Journal, abbreviated as COSE, is a peer-reviewed international journal. It takes the relationship between meaning and mind as its central concern. It welcomes submission of unpublished research from all theoretical orientations in linguistics. It is also intended to be a forum for scholars in related fields, such as psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, philosophy, and education, to disseminate their work studying the many and varied aspects of human cognition. So here are the websites for online submission and instructions for authors. And this is our WeChat official platform. Currently, we have over 9,000 followers. Today, we have Professor Glynn with us. His research focuses on developing quantified methods for the description and explanation of language, assuming the usage-based model and the theory of cognitive linguistics. Language is an inherently dynamic and varied system that emerges from use. Its structure is assumed to be holistic, which also means non-modular, and conceptually, also functionally motivated. How to account for language scientifically, making those assumptions, therefore, is the general aim of all his research. Here are some publications from Professor Glynn. So today, the keywords of his lecture include behavioral profile approach, multivariate statistics, conceptual metaphor, grammatical constructions. So the floor is yours, Professor Glynn.
Okay. So, no, we tried this earlier. Stop share, I'll try again.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully this will work this time. There we go. Hello. Yes, so thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. The honor is all mine, sincerely. Today I will be talking about usage-based cognitive models or usage-based concepts, whatever sort of terminology you prefer. Oh, that doesn't work anymore. Here we are. So basically what I'll be looking at is how can the behavioral profile approach, which is a method I expect most of you are at least a little bit familiar with, how this sort of method can be applied to the description of abstract concepts. Now, idealized cognitive models, where this is a cover-all term for different types of concepts proposed by Lakoff, things like conceptual metaphors, cultural differences, sort of differences in conceptualization across cultures, but also semantic frames, the sort of things that you use in construction grammar. So this is the sort of stuff we'll be looking at. How can we take the behavioral profile approach and apply it to these types of objects of study? So the outline is quite straightforward. First of all, we'll begin with the problem. I'll quickly explain what a cognitive model is. I expect most of you are familiar with that idea, but just to make sure everybody is on board. And then we'll briefly look at what the problem is. Then the proposal, well, the proposal is the behavioral profile approach. We'll look at that. And then we'll look at a couple of case studies examining the concept of anger across a couple of languages. We'll be looking at anger because it's a very popular concept to look at in cognitive semantics. Hello? Okay.
Sorry.
So that's
Mhm.
fine. That's fine. So, pardon me. The idealized cognitive model. Yeah, well, is it important? Well, yeah. It was the cornerstone in the heyday of cognitive semantics as a sort of fundamental analytical tool for conceptual metaphors, prototype set categories, lexical polysemy, cross-cultural things, conceptual analysis across cultures, grammatical constructions, all the goodies that were the mainstay of cognitive linguistic research for a couple of decades, and still form the foundation of most of our research in cognitive semantics. So the idealized cognitive model really is very fundamental to the research paradigm. What is it exactly? Well, Lakoff proposed it in 1987, I think, as a sort of a catch-all term to unite the different heuristics, the different approaches in the field to produce a unified methodological apparatus for cognitive semantics. So that's basically what it is. It was designed to bring together research in prototype concepts such as polysemy and synonymy, semantic frames, such as the things you use in argument structure constructions, etc., in construction grammar, conceptual domains, the things you look at in conceptual metaphor theory, and also those sort of cultural studies, the things like democracy and fatherhood, those big questions you look at across cultures and societies. So it's a valid and important objective, a unified set of analytical assumptions for all cognitive semantic research. That's an idealized cognitive model. Sounds great. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that it's idealized. It's not intended to be necessarily valid for any specific speaker in any specific context. Okay, you might say, well, that's fine. It's a model, right? So models are designed to be simplifications of the world. They're meant to describe the world, but they're meant to be simplifications, so they shouldn't necessarily always be applicable. The problem is we have no way of determining how well they describe the world. We have no way of repeating their results or judging how accurately they represent the phenomenon they were proposed to represent. In a sense, these ICMs, these abstract concepts, whether they are metaphors, whether they're argument structure constructions, whatever, they're not actually descriptions of language. They are hypotheses about structure and language. And that's the problem. Well, it's not really a problem. It's not really a problem if you think of them as hypotheses, as proposals. The problem is if you think of them as descriptions. So if we accept ICMs or abstract concepts or whatever you want to call them as hypotheses about language, mind, and culture, rather than theories about actual descriptions of language, mind, and culture, there's no problem at all. So I will take that assumption that when you propose love as a metaphor or the commercial event frame or whatever, or whichever ICM you're talking about, if you think of that as a theory, then there's no problem. The question then is, how can we test the theory? How can you test semantic frames, prototype sets, metaphors? How can you see how well they account for language use? We need to take the theoretical cognitive models and make them into empirical cognitive models. I can't see anybody's faces, so I hope that I'm being clear. Now, those of you with some knowledge of the history of linguistics may recognize an allusion to Chomsky here, descriptive, predictive, and explanatory adequacy. I don't think they're exactly the terms he used, but that's more or less, I think, what he was talking about. Now, not everything, well, probably everything Chomsky has ever said is contrary to the foundations of cognitive semantics, but surely we can learn from him still. And I would really argue we could learn from his commitment to methodological rigor, especially in the early days. And this idea of descriptive, predictive, and explanatory power or adequacy, credibility to Chomsky for teaching us linguists about it, but it's fundamental to all scientific research. Okay, it's nothing new. It goes back to in the philosophy of science. It has a long history. Now, basically, what it is that a proposal, whether it's a model or a theory or a hypothesis, some scientific proposal, should account for all the existing observations, all the things we already know, right? That's pretty obvious. But then it should also predict new observations, but importantly, without predicting things that we do not observe. It should also have explanatory adequacy, but that's the more theoretical side of things that we won't look at today. That's the sort of things that most of cognitive semantics was doing in the 80s and 90s, the explanatory adequacy. But now we're looking at the descriptive and predictive adequacy. Now, I don't know, I expect most of you are like, yeah, we know this, but in case somebody is not completely on board with this, it's a very, very important point when you're evaluating scientific descriptions. With my first year students, I tend to give the example, it's a silly example, but it gets a laugh, that, I ask my students, so why is the sky blue? And of course, nobody knows why the sky is blue. I don't even know if I know why the sky is blue. That's not the point, okay? In science, we ask questions we don't know the answers to, which we're trying to explain the world. Now, inevitably, one of the students will say, well, the sky is blue because it reflects the sea. The sea is blue and it reflects under the sky, and that makes the sky blue. And I'm like, okay, that's a hypothesis. That's a proposal. Now, it accounts for the observations we already have. We can see the sky is blue, we can see the sea is blue, and we know that light reflects off water, so that's good. It's a good hypothesis. It accounts for the existing observations. Now, can we make a prediction with that hypothesis that will test the hypothesis? So I say, okay, if we go to the center of Europe, or the center of China, or wherever you go, a long way away from the sea, we would predict the sky would be less blue. Now, of course, if you go to the center of China, the color of the sky doesn't change, and it's because the sky isn't blue because of the sea. But that you've falsified your hypothesis, your proposal. It's that type of thinking that, I mean, I know it's obvious, but that type of scientific approach, we need to be able to apply to concepts. Idealized cognitive models, semantic frames, metaphors, argument structure constructions, it doesn't matter. That concepts, we need to be able to apply that to this object of study in cognitive semantics. That is the concept. That's the challenge. Now, a little bit more, what exactly are concepts? What are we dealing with here? What is our object of study? So we're linguists, okay? So grammar is our object of study, but what is that? Well, language structure. Fine. Now, I think there are very few assumptions that, I mean, the term cognitive semantics is a very broad umbrella. And I think there are not many things we all agree upon. But I would say that inarguably, there are two fundamental assumptions that all cognitive semanticists share. If you don't believe in these things, I don't think you're doing cognitive semantics. One, that language structure or grammar is usage-based, right? So it's entrenched structure, which results from usage. So it's probability-driven, it's usage-based. The other is that it's concept-based. It's not formal. But those concepts are prototype structured. So they're also, they're continuous, they're not discrete. But these two assumptions, that it's usage-based and what is entrenched is concepts related to forms, not forms themselves. So what is learned in usage is not formal rules, it's conceptual rules or patterns. This is the basis of cognitive semantics. I would even argue those two sentences there summarize the two seminal works of cognitive linguistics, Langacker 87 and Lakoff 87. Now, the problem we have is that, well, how can you test hypotheses with those assumptions? Now, in mentalist, structuralist, generativists, rule-based approaches to language, the sort of things we don't do, you can use grammaticality tests and truth conditional tests to determine the descriptive and predictive power or adequacy or accuracy of the model. But we can't use them. You can't use a grammaticality test. Well, maybe if you did a lot of grammaticality tests, you could get some information about probability-based structures and usage-based understanding of grammar. Maybe. But you certainly can't use a truth conditional test because a prototype category has good examples and bad examples, not truth examples. It's not discrete. So we can't, if we accept the assumptions of cognitive linguistics that language is based on concepts and it's structured through usage, then we can't really use these sorts of methods. Now, the next slide this is a very dense slide. I'm sorry, that will be the last dense slide, I hope. But we need to get through this because this is exactly what we're trying to do. This is the aim, if you like, of an empirical cognitive semantics. First of all, so usage-based model of language. Now, I know you're all familiar with the term, but have you really thought about what it entails, what it implies? It means that grammar results from usage. That means it is determined by patterns, not rules. These patterns emerge from usage. What that entails is that grammar is inherently varied and dynamic. That means that it necessarily will be maybe only a little bit, but different from one speaker to the next, because every speaker has different usage experience. But also, as you grow older, you have different experiences. So it changes even in your lifetime. Now, it may be that the changes over a person's lifetime or between two people from the same dialect, socioeconomic context are so negligible we can ignore them. But in principle, if you're making a generalization about an entire language, we have to have an analytical tool that can parsimoniously, as simply as possible, account for this sort of complexity. Our objective study is dynamic and varied. It is varied and changing. Now, the cognitive model of grammar, and not everybody who believes in the usage-based model of language believes in the cognitive model of grammar, but most do, especially since most functional grammarians, although they use different terminology, also agree with this. Now, grammaticality in this model of language, which we use in cognitive semantics, is determined by concepts. The functional grammarians call them functions, but it's the same thing. They're both categories. They're categories that are determined, okay, structured by prototypes, not truth conditions. They're based on human experience, determined by general cognitive skills. That's not what's relevant here. The structure of these categories and, well, the structure of these, our object of study, the rules, the categories, are non-observable and they're non-discrete. We don't have NP, our structure is not NPs and VPs. You can't have NP1, VP, NP2. That's discrete and it's vaguely observable. We have agents and patients and instruments. Now, not only is an agent a non-observable category, it's not discrete. So he broke the window. Fine, there you've got a prototypical agent. The hammer broke the window. Is the hammer an agent? So it's very, very easy. It's very, very easy to show that where we're looking for the rules, not only are those rules probabilistic and varied and dynamic and emerging and all those sorts of things, they're non-observable and they're non-discrete. That is our object of study. That's grammar in cognitive semantics. And it's really, really, really a very difficult thing to be able to do scientifically, but that's the challenge that we face, okay, in cognitive semantics. So what's the solution? That's easy. The behavioral profile approach. Now, I'm sure most of you, probably all of you, have heard the term. It's quite fashionable. But we're going to now really be looking at how we can extend it beyond just describing lexemes and grammatical constructions, which is normally how it's used, to see how we can use it to, you know, analyze concepts, okay, idealize cognitive models. Well, they won't be idealized, they'll be profile-based or usage-based. So what is the behavioral profile approach? Well, it goes back to at least the idea of Firth. I'm sure you all know the "you shall know a word by the company it keeps" quote. This principle is the idea behind profile-based analysis. Now, in this sense of profile-based, well, all of corpus linguistics and all of discourse analysis, most sociolinguistics and all computational linguistics would be profile-based approach. So that's not a very useful understanding of the term. We don't use the term in that way. So the, pardon me. When we use the term profile-based approach, we're looking at a specific method which developed in cognitive linguistics back in the 80s and 90s. People like Dirven, who founded cognitive linguistics, the school, and Woodcott Austin, who unfortunately died not there long after, and Heratz, who founded the journal Cognitive Linguistics, a bunch with Greece, you also know. These people sort of were taking this idea and applying it to synonymy and constructions. But it was also massively influenced by the lexicographic tradition, people like Aprecian and Atkins, etc., and so forth, who entirely independently developed the same idea. So in the beginning of the 21st century, there was lots of research which were looking at the behavioral profiles of lexical and constructional synonymy and polysemy. When we're talking about constructions, we normally call it alternations, but it's the same thing, okay? So the profile of how these words and syntactic patterns are used. Now, as you probably know, in cognitive linguistics, the constructicon and the lexicon are sort of all entwined, so you can't really look at one without the other. I've sort of artificially separated and put a few references there, but there were lots of research of this kind at the beginning of the 21st century. So what were all of these studies doing? Well, they were all used manual feature analysis. Now, I've put that first here because I think that's the thing that most traditional linguists get confused with. The profile-based approach, when we use the term in this sense here, does not look at collocations or collostructions or collocations. It looks at features of usage. So people read the individual examples, read them manually, and laboriously annotate them for characteristics of use. So it's not collocations, it's combinatorial possibilities of how the words or constructions are used. Well, we'll come back to that. If you're not following that, don't worry, we'll look at it again. But because it's manual like that, because it's very laborious, you really can't do more than a couple of thousand examples. The samples are relatively small. Now, in corpus linguistics, you'll often look at the entire corpus. You'll have a very, very large sample. With behavioral analysis, you're normally looking at a relatively small sample. This also means that we have to be more careful and tend to look at more specific types of language rather than making generalizations about language. But again, we'll come to that later. But the third thing is that because we're looking not just at collocations, so left and right and maybe part of speech or something like that, we're looking at a lot of different stuff. Who was the agent? Who was the patient? What type of patient was it? What was the relationship between the agent and the patient? All these sorts of things. We have a lot of variables. It's really complex data. And so we need to use multivariate statistics to look for the combinatorial possibilities that emerge, the patterns that emerge that constitute the profile of the thing that we're looking at. So they're the sort of three characteristics of the approach. More sort of formally, in 2009, there was a book came out where Divyak and I, was Divyak with Greece, we both had articles which sort of formally proposed this method. I didn't call it the behavioral profile. I called it usage feature analysis, but it doesn't matter. Behavioral profile is the term that became most widely used, and it's an excellent term. And we both sort of formally proposed this method. And they and I, but following them, there's the different steps. And the first step is data collection or tokenization. So you go to a corpus and you extract a representative, this is their terms, retrieval of a representative sample of a phenomenon in question from a corpus. Yeah, you get data, you get examples. Then you analyze those examples. You read each instance, each occurrence, each utterance, each example. You read it and you analyze it, you annotate it, you tag it. The word they use is tag, the word I use is annotate, just means the same thing. You tag it for different, I use usage features, they use characteristics of use, for instances in the sample. So you annotate it for all the different characteristics of its use. Then you remove the examples and you're left with the data about how these examples are used. You've got the metadata. And there you need to use some sort of statistics to model what's going on in that metadata. What combinations of usage characteristics emerge as being marked or interesting or distinctive or whatever you're looking for. I hope that's clear. That's essentially the behavioral profile approach. Basically, we examine language use for semantic, not collocational patterns, and we interpret those patterns as indices of emergent structure, not rules. Okay. Now, I have some slides here where I look at the pros and cons. I'm not going to go through those slides now. I'm going to leave them. We can come back to them in the question stage if you want. The problems with this approach are well known, well documented in the literature. So I've got a couple of slides which summarize those. I just want to finish just on this one point, is that the basic positive is this gives us quantification of qualitative analysis. We have semantic, pragmatic, discourse type analysis. And this method allows us to quantify the results of this qualitative analysis. Why is quantification good? Well, it allows you to get the descriptive and predictive adequacy of the things you're studying here, concepts. So that's the whole point of it, right? So that's the main reason for doing this, allowing us to determine how well these concepts or these idealized cognitive models or these metaphors or whatever we're looking at, how well they allow us to account for language. Quantification permits us to do that. So these are the slides I'll skip. Again, well-known problems, and we can come back to them if you wish. Okay, the case studies. How am I going for time? Yeah. So we're going to look at anger, just because, well, anger is, I don't know, an old popular. The first one we're going to be looking at, well, the ontology of the cognitive model, so the actual structure of the concept of anger. Now, we'll be looking at English, British, American, Czech, and Slovak there. And then the second one, we'll move and sort of zoom in and look at the metaphors that are used to understand that abstract concept of anger. Okay, so two related but different research questions. So the first study is with Juliana from Olomouc in Czechia. Czechia is a state somewhere between Poland and France. And it's, sorry, we looking to identify sort of the ICM, the idealized cognitive model of anger, but not with the use of lexemes, just the actual concept itself, not the lexical structure of the concept. We'll come to that. And the reason we're doing that is because we actually want to compare our results with the results in psychology. When you talk to psychologists about emotions, they're like, yeah, but we're not interested in what words people use. We want to actually know about well, they don't study the concepts, they study the emotional responses. So in order to compare our results with those in psychology, we needed to take away the linguistic dimension, if you wanted. And that was the origin of this study here. Is that possible? Now, a point of warning, I will say this at least twice in this talk. If you're contrasting, if you're looking at different cultures or different languages and you're using this sort of analysis, it is very essential that your corpora are completely comparable. It's absolutely essential that you don't, because if you find differences in your data, is it because there are differences in your two corpora, or is it because there's a difference in how the two cultures conceptualize the world? So you want to make sure that you've controlled for variation between your corpora as much as possible. All of our data come from personal diaries written typically by young women about their personal lives. And so as best as we can tell, the two corpora are very, very comparable. We did run tests to see if there's differences in topic of discourse and these sorts of things. And we're reasonably confident that these corpora are comparable. So they're very, very similar. Now, the other good thing about these diaries is the type of data. So because the diaries, the personal accounts of the daily life, emotions are discussed in in a lot of detail. And the language is informal and narrative. So they're telling you what happened. And this descriptive language allows you to get a lot of information about how people are talking about these emotions, which is super important if you want to compare your results with psychologists. So that's why we're using this data as well. Now, the next problem. Since this study, unlike usual behavioral analyses, we want to study the concept, not the specifically lexical structure. how do we get examples of the concept? How do we get examples of people talking about anger? Well, we use keywords. This is a problem, but we can't read, and it's very difficult to read an entire corpus looking for instances of anger. So we used frequency determined keywords. So we didn't look in dictionaries to find out the first entries, well, not dictionaries, the thesauruses to find out the first entrance or anything like that. We took all of the words which can denote anger in each of the languages. We went to the corpora and found the most frequent of those. Then we read subsamples of each of those and worked out the relative proportion, not of how frequent the words are, but of how frequent the words with that meaning are. Okay, because polysemy is a real problem with this sort of stuff. So for example, mad in American English means angry, but mad in British English means crazy. So you have to actually go in and read and see how many of these occurrences actually refer to anger. So these are the most frequently used words to talk about anger in these three corpora. These are the four most frequently used words to talk about anger in these four corpora. Okay, so that's how we determine. We use these terms to retrieve the instances of people discussing anger. Now, what do we analyze them for? So we get all of these examples of anger. There are 800. Great. How do we analyze them? So we do the semantic frame, right? We go straight to the semantic frame. That's what we're studying here, right? The idealized cognitive model of anger. We start with the semantic frame. There are 4 participants, 4 potential arguments in the semantic frame of anger. You have the cause, the thing that causes the anger, the person who's upset, the emoter, the person who gets yelled at, and the person who's responsible. Sometimes these are one and the same, but it's very easy to come out with a sentence which shows that there are potentially 4 separate arguments in the event. I am angry with Sam because Jamie broke the CD. Who uses a CD? Why did I get this example? Okay, I need to change this example. But you understand, right? So it is possible to have all 4 arguments. So we analyzed all 4 arguments. We read all 800 examples and we analyzed them for example, what's the gender of the person who is upset? Was the person upset? Did they get angry with the person who is responsible? Was there aggression? Did the person who was upset, did they try to change the event? What was their behavior? Did they get sad? What did they do? We read all of them for all of these things, right? Was the cause, was the norm violation in the event? Was there injustice with respect to the emoter? Was it a predictable event, right? Yeah, I'm always angry with this linguistics class starting late. What type of cause was it? Characteristics of the person responsible. Was it somebody you know who's responsible for the event? Was there intention on the part? So we went through. Now, these features here, we didn't just invent them off the top of our head. These features come from social psychology, and they're the sort of characteristics they use to categorize different emotions. This is directly developed from the GRID project. I won't go into it because it's not directly relevant to our talk here. But in social psychology, this was a very large international study looking at the emotions across the world's languages. These are subjective analyses. So we had 2 people doing the analysis, and we only included factors where the 2 raters, the 2 coders, the 2 taggers agreed with a very high level of reliability. We used the Cohen kappa to determine that. So the results. Now, traditionally, the next step would be straightforward, right? You look at the lexemes and you get a picture of the lexical semantics. We determine the relations between these lexemes. This word is used in this situation. This word is used in this situation, or this word translates best to this word. I'm doing a study right now on Chinese and French, looking at translating nervousness and the different ways to translate it. It's standard, straightforward research using the behavioral profile approach. We didn't do that here. Instead, we wanted to see what would happen if you remove the lexemes. So rather than finding out the relationships between the different lexemes across the languages, we wanted to look at the concept per se, the concept without the lexical structure, so that we could compare our results with those of psychology. Remember, concepts are not actually discrete. They're not rarefied. They are continuous and slippery. Lexemes are discrete. So we wanted to remove that dimension. Of course, it's still structured by the lexemes because we use the lexemes to retrieve the instances, but the actual results themselves are no longer structured by the lexical categories. Those of you familiar with the sort of work that we do may know this. This is a correspondence analysis. It's perfect for comparing results with social psychology because they use something called principal components analysis, which gives you comparable, well, similar sorts of plots and results. Now, reading these things can be a little bit difficult, but it's not too bad. Basically, it looks at every different possible combination, all the combinatorial possibilities of all the different characteristics of use. And if one given set of combinations of characteristics of use are much more are noticeable, are frequent, are important in the data, it will put them close together on the plot. So relative proximity on the plot is relatively high association in the behavior of, well, pardon me, the language used. So at the top here, you immediately see this clumping. And this is a very marked usage, right? It's a long way from everything else. It's very distinct. And here you have a situation where the person who did the bad thing did it intentionally. And what they did was a norm violation. And the response of the person who was upset was strong. There was a strong emotional response. And they got physically aggressive with the person who did the bad thing. So this is a very marked, distinct type of anger event. It's, you know, somebody punches you in the face and you punch them back type thing. This is very distinct and very marked and comes out here up on top. Down here on the right, we also have this big clumping of other characteristics of use. And these are situations where the idea of injustice is not really applicable, nor is intention is not applicable. There's no norm violation. What is responsible for the event is just the state of affairs, stuff in the world. The behavior of the person who's upset is to look for comfort or distraction. They don't try and control the cause. There's nothing, they can't change the event. And the level of emotion is quite neutral. They're not really angry. It's not weak anger. They're angry, but like they're not going to start yelling or anything. This is situations like, you know, it's raining and you wanted to go on a picnic. You're angry because I can't go on a picnic because it's raining. Well, what are you going to do about it? It's like, this is another type of anger that emerges from this use. So we can go on and go through other types of anger, but that's probably enough for today. That shows you how these sorts of, the structure of the concept emerges from the characteristics of people talking about anger events. And interestingly, it corroborates largely what the social psychologists find, although we have some dimensions here that they miss. Since we're using ecological data with natural contexts, they're using experimental data where they control for context. We get some extra information that they don't get, but largely we corroborate their findings. So that's exactly what the sort of stuff you can do. This is extending the, rather than just what we normally do with behavioral analysis is just looking at the lexical semantic structure, if you like, of the concept. We've gone beyond that and we're saying, can we look at the concept, the idealized cognitive model per se, not just the lexical semantic structure. We've established how to do that. We know how to do that for 25 years. Can we go further with it? How can we use this to really look at abstract concepts, idealized cognitive models? And it appears that the answer is we can. But can we actually find, this is very subjective. Can we actually get a little bit more information about some underlying structure? Because that's what the psychologists are really interested in. They want to know how many types of anger there are. Is there some underlying structure to anger, the experience of anger? They look at the experience, not the conceptualization, but the experience. Now, this is the results we have. These are the actual data points. So these are the examples responsible for this structuring in the data. So you can go in and look at example 236 and see what it is. This is the data cloud itself. But we're going to run a cluster analysis on this. Now, those of you who are familiar with behavioral analysis will know that cluster analysis is a very popular way of looking at our data. Now, what this does here, this is a k-medoid. Here, our k is 3. We've looked at this data and we've said, okay, 1, 2, 3 clusters. Can you sort these examples? These are the examples. Can you sort these examples into 3 anger event types? 3 different types of anger, 3 different event types. And so it's got little circles, little crosses, and little triangles. And the answer is no. The circles are quite distinct, right? So this first sorting attempt, it does quite well. But when you look at little crosses, almost every instance of a cross is potentially belonging to the circle or the triangle cluster. And the same with the triangle, okay? And if you, this is another way of looking at it. This is with scores. These should all be about 50 at least. And it's 15, 18, oh no, sorry, 33, 20, and 19. It fails to sort these events into 3 types of anger, unlike the social psychologists who do manage to get that. So what's wrong? Well, instead of using cluster analysis, we can use factor analysis, which is actually closer to what they use, principal components analysis. And we run the factor analysis on the results of the cluster of the correspondence analysis. And here we get a much clearer picture. So the different colors here are again attempts at clustering or sorting the examples. These are the examples. But rather than sorting the examples themselves, they sort the examples as they are represented in the correspondence analysis. So instead of sorting the examples, you're trying to sort the pattern that emerges here. You're trying to not sort, but classify, structure the pattern that emerges here. And the results are excellent. We can see over here that the black is quite distinct. The green and the red overlap, but remember, we're talking about concepts here. If they were completely distinct, we wouldn't need to use statistics, okay? This is a perfect result. This is an ideal result. We have a situation where we have conceptual structure, which is continuous, but still distinct enough to be talking about different underlying types or structures in the cognitive model. So we're getting a picture of not only of the concept of anger, but structure internal to that concept, to the idealized cognitive model of anger. How am I going for time? Okay. Now, so that's great. Wonderful. Good news. But as linguists, we're often more interested in the differences between cultures rather than looking for universal structures. So people like Wierzbicka and Kovacs, but also the sort of research by Littlemore has looked at, differences in how we understand concepts and stuff. So let's see if we can, do the same thing, not using the lexemes, but add the language. Can we contrast the concept of anger? How is it different across languages? Do we all experience and understand anger in the same way? Probably not. We may experience anger in the same way, but I'm sure we don't conceptualize it in the same way. So here we have the same results. Again, no lexical structure, just the concept per se, but we've added the language. So now we're asking the model, okay, what characteristics of anger are associated with which languages? Relatively, of course, all the different angers occur in all the languages. But are any associations sort of distinctive? First of all, we see that Czech and Slovak are right next to each other. So relative to the things that we're looking at here, at least, there's no difference in how Czechs and Slovaks talk about anger. And therefore, if how people talk about emotions is an index to how they understand emotions, then they probably understand them in the same way. Over here, the British and the American are relatively similar, but also quite distinct. And we'll see some of these characteristics are way up here, which means they're rather distinct, rather uniquely associated with the British way of talking about anger. And you see the British are much more concerned about these instances where, it was raining and they couldn't go on the picnic type thing, where the Americans are more interested in things such as events where there was no injustice, but they're angry anyway. If you know Czech and Slovakian culture, you'll know that they're quite semi-humorously famous for never getting very upset and being very reasonable, and they're distinctly associated with the behavior of negotiate and discuss and remedy and reverse, which tends to cause a few giggles to anybody who knows the Czechs and Slovaks and their rather famous way of dealing with conflict. Now, again, we can run the same sort of factor analysis, and we get very clear that the Czech and the Slovak is very, very different from the British and the American. The British and the American tend to overlap a little bit, but we're getting the same sort of picture. Now, you need to remember that this is emerging from the data. These corpora are very, very comparable. The topic of discourse is comparable. The same sort of people writing about the same sorts of things. They're just writing about anger, but we're getting a very different picture of how they talk about anger. Is that an index of a conceptual difference between the cultures? That's the explanatory adequacy. That's a separate issue. But for today, at least we've got descriptive adequacy. Do we have predictive adequacy? I don't know. I can't see any of you, and I don't know how familiar you are with regression analysis. I assume you know what it is and stuff. I won't go into too much detail, but this is predictive modeling. So we're asking the question here, can we, without looking at the example, using the features that we've used to describe the discussions of anger, okay, can we predict, without looking, whether it was an American person writing, a British person writing, a Czech or a Slovakian person writing? Now, if we can predict who was writing in the diary based on how they spoke about anger, then how they speak about anger is distinctive. It's different, because if you can use it to predict who's speaking, then obviously it's distinctive. So the first piece of information we want to look at here is this is the C-score, the concordance statistic. It's not a percentage of accuracy. It's much better than a percentage of accuracy. But if you were to convert it to a percentage of accuracy, it'd be about 90%. So about 90% of the time, using the different factors and features of responsible, emoter, cause, yeah, those three, using a combination of those characteristics of use, we can predict that it's an American person writing. So that would suggest that these characteristics are actually distinctive, that we can distinguish how Americans talk about anger with these characteristics most of the time. The British are harder to distinguish. Here we have a C of about 65. So here, although, yeah, we can distinguish the British, we can guess that it's a British person, we tend to get it wrong a lot, right? So our model is not as predictively accurate for British. It's very predictively accurate for Americans, but not for British. We haven't managed to find the distinctive characteristics of how British talk about anger. Maybe they just don't have any. Czech, quite distinctive, we're at 80, and Slovakian 65 as well. So we're getting scores on how well these characteristics distinguish the different cultures when they talk about anger. As like I said a couple of times, is that an index of a conceptual difference? I'll leave that up for the theoretical discussion, but at least we have empirical, predictive, and descriptive evidence on how well we can distinguish these concepts between the cultures. We also have what characteristics are responsible for that distinction. So the minus numbers means this is disassociated. So family, as somebody responsible for the anger event, is disassociated with American, where non-injustice is associated with Americans. So Americans very, very typically get angry in situations where there was no injustice relative to British, Czech, and Slovak, and so forth. So we have the overall predictive adequacy. We have also what features and characteristics are responsible for the different profiles of the different cultures. This is exactly the sort of stuff that we're aiming to get. This is an empirical, quantitative, okay, cognitive semantics. We're getting pictures of differences, cultural differences that are repeatable, that are predictive, that are descriptive, that we can really use. But it's based on qualitative, original semantic analysis. Okay, so in the second case study, hopefully will be a little bit easier. It's a little bit closer to what we're used to. We're going to be looking at metaphors now. This time we're looking at Russian and British and American. And again, it's some work with somebody from Czechia, Irina. So we want to now look at, okay, people do conceptual metaphor studies, and people like Kovacev and so on and so forth will say, oh, this is this metaphor in this language and this metaphor in that language. And we want to actually know, okay, empirically, descriptively, predictively, what's going on. Okay, we've got the models. We know what metaphors supposedly exist. We want to know how they're used. Yeah, okay. Do all of these metaphors exist in both of these languages? Okay, then are they used in the same way in these languages? These are the sorts of questions we want to know. We want to know how descriptively and predictively adequate our models are. the model being the metaphor here. Now, the first step, again, we have to have really comparable corpora. We have to make sure that our Russian and our English corpora are really, really comparable. And this time we're sure that they were developed at the same time. They're very, very similar corpora. One of the most comparable corpora. I think it's the most comparable corpus I've ever seen. I developed especially for these purposes. Again, we use the same idea of the frequent lexemes. This time we use 3, not 4. The most frequent lexemes in the languages for denoting anger, exactly the same thing. We read the examples to make sure that they are examples referring to anger, and then we use that as the frequency, the relative frequency of the lexemes, not the actual, how often the form occurs. But then we have another step, and this is where it starts getting messy. There is a problem, which is, I think, a fundamental problem. I will mention it now. It's sort of an aside. I could just ignore it, but I want to mention it. I find systematically across languages, I've now looked at a lot of languages, from Chinese and Japanese through to English and French, and systematically, when a concept is profiled nominally, so when we typically use nouns, typically as in frequency, when most frequently we use a noun to talk about a concept, then that concept is treated more frequently metaphorically. So there seems to be some sort of association or correlation between using nouns to talk about concepts and metaphoric treatment of concepts. Now, it could just be that we talk about abstract things nominally more often, and therefore more abstract things we tend to use metaphors more often. I don't know. These are open questions. The problem is that if you're comparing languages and one language tends to use a noun to talk about a given concept and another language doesn't, you're going to get a massive bias, a skewing in the data when you're looking at metaphors. I don't have a solution to this. Me and Anatol and Stefanovic, we're working on some ideas to find a solution to this. We haven't, it's just like coffee table conversation for the moment. We haven't done anything concrete. It's not an obvious question. So what we did here is we just took the words that are most commonly used in these languages. So in English, it's angry, pissed off, and anger. In American, angry, mad, anger. In Russian, gniev, vesiet, and zloy. These words are the most frequent. We read them, okay, and we extracted metaphoric examples. So we didn't include non-metaphoric examples. We read through all of the examples, found the examples that used a metaphor. We only kept those as our sample. Now you see immediately, gniev in Russian, that's the noun, 55%. In English, anger, 52%. And anger in American, 44%. Only 1% of angry and mad, 0 pissed offs were metaphorical. So you see that most of the occurrences were in the metaphoric occurrences were with nominal profilings of the concept. Anyway, that's what we did. Once we have a sample of metaphors, okay, then the next problem occurs, the source concept. Concepts are non-discrete, non-observable. Where does one concept begin and another concept end? How we did it is we took the colloquy in the utterance, which is responsible for the the figurativity of the example. We made a list of them, and we looked for semantic patterns, but it was entirely subjective. Determining which source concepts, which semantic categories of lexemes form a concept is really, really very difficult. We'll see some examples of it in a few seconds, but we just clumped them into discrete categories such as fluid, fire, opponent. These sorts of, fire. What is it? Anger is a heated fluid in a container. These sorts of things. We'll see some examples, but this process is a really weak step in the method because it's very, very subjective. Also, not all metaphoric examples belong to conceptual metaphors. Okay, you can have metaphoric examples which are just ad hoc or lexical or whatever. So there were lots of examples which weren't lots. There were many examples, 13, which were not actually in the end classified as an example, an instance of a conceptual metaphor. Now, once we've identified the instances of conceptual metaphors, we then analyzed the characteristics of their use, the behavioral profile of the metaphors. So we have the intensity of the emotion. This was done on a 9-point Likert scale. So you have two raters. This is an interesting heuristic. You have two raters. Both people just subjectively go, oh, it was intense, 7, 8. You then compare the two raters, and on a scale of 9, with a granularity of 9 points, they will never agree. You reduce that to 5, and they start agreeing. You reduce it to 3, and then you get a kappa, which says this is repeatable, this is reliable. So you can use this heuristic to get reliable analysis of very, very subjective things, such as degree of intensity, looking at a corpus. That's the method used there. We also analyzed it for things such as in the previous study, who is responsible and what the cause was. I hope I'm going okay for time. I probably have another 5 minutes to go, maybe max 10. Let me know if I'm going over. Okay, so the first thing is to look at the descriptive power of the metaphors proposed with the introspective research, the traditional research. And we were sort of happily surprised here. We often find some of the metaphors that are attested in the traditional literature to be quite funny. Yeah, we'll see some of them on the next slide. Let's see if I can move this thing out of the way here. We were surprised by the richness in the language. Okay, the amount of metaphors that were used, the amount of different types of metaphors. But we had trouble distinguishing these source domains. So we ended up putting anger is a fluid, liquid, in a container, fire. We put all of this just together because it was very difficult. When you read the Curvature and this sort of traditional armchair linguistics, they have these nice examples. But when you've got the real data, is that anger is that a heated fluid? Is it in a container? I don't know. So we ended up just lumping them together. We found anger as an opponent. That's 15 out of 190 in English and 5 out of 160 in Russian. This one was the most common, 115 out of 190 and 60 out of 160. Interestingly, anger is insanity, which we expected to be the most frequent, was quite rare. Only 5 out of 160 examples, metaphoric examples, was anger, insanity in Russian. 0 in English. However, we didn't include, so mad literally means insane, and we didn't count them as metaphors. So perhaps that results not very, depends on your interpretation of what is a metaphor there. But then we get to the metaphors that the traditional approaches have proposed, that the traditional approaches have proposed, that we didn't expect to find. And we did, much to our. So anger is a plant, anger is a horse, anger is a machine. Anger is a dangerous animal. There were 8 of them in Russian. Now, sometimes these examples were, maybe it isn't an example of that, maybe it is. We didn't include them in the quantitative analysis anyway, because there were so few of them. But it was interesting that the sort of things proposed by introspective research, so the introspective research is a hypothesis, right? It's a theory. It said it predicts to find these weird, crazy metaphors, and we did. That's testimony to the absolute quality of the introspective traditional research. We didn't expect to find them, and we did, right? So the traditional introspective analysis was right, and we were wrong. But not always. There are also metaphors that were predicted that we didn't find, but it was a small sample, so it's very likely that we would have found them if we had more data. Okay, so now that we've got the metaphors and we've analyzed them for the behavioral profiles, okay, first of all, we saw that some metaphors are more common in one language than the other. That's immediately interesting, okay? That means that some languages use some metaphors more often than other languages, which is a difference between the languages and cultures. But the next step we want to know is, okay, maybe language X uses one metaphor more often than another language, but when they do use it, do they use it differently? That's a separate question. And that was the next question we tried to answer. So here's another one of these plots. And actually, the answer is not really. English and Russian definitely use some metaphors more frequently than others. And there are definitely differences, but overall, there are probably more similarities than differences in how the metaphors are used. So if you look here, we'll see personification Russian, personification English, right next to each other. They're used in exactly the same way with relative to intensity and cause. Manipulable object English, opponent English, manipulable object Russian, opponent Russian. Okay, there's a little bit of difference here. These guys are down in weak intensity, and these are neutral intensity, but they're both equally associated with states of affairs as a cause. Subtle difference, but more or less the same. Okay, here's the weapon English, here's the weapon Russian. So we're getting a picture. There's some subtle differences in how the metaphors are used, but overall, these metaphors are used the same way in the two languages. Turning to the right side of the plot, we see again a lot of similarity. The container metaphor in English and Russian, almost identical. Fire, English and Russian, again, right next to each other. However, we do see fluid in English is down here with relationships and jealousy, where fluid is right up here with injustice in Russian. So there are potentially some differences. This is intensity and responsible as opposed to intensity and cause. And we get a similar sort of picture, okay? How am I going for time? Yeah, so we won't go into details here. The picture we're getting here is, again, there are some differences, but overall, the metaphors, although they're different frequencies of use in the two languages, when they are used, they're used in a very similar way. But as we'll see in a couple of seconds, it's not entirely the same. We can try and cluster them using the factor, and you'll see it doesn't work, right? Using the factor analysis here, you don't find structure. The Russian and the English metaphors of anger are used in a massively overlapping way. If we try a regression model, well, here you'll see that there are some significant differences. Here we're predicting the language with intensity, cause, and responsible. Yeah, there's some differences, but not a big difference. But when we add cause and responsible as random effects to the model and use metaphor to predict language, we get a very strong model 90. So the difference between Russian and English is not in how the metaphors are used, but rather which metaphors are used, which in itself is interesting and a good result. The very last slide, results slide. This is a mosaic plot. These are notoriously difficult to interpret if you're not used to them. But I'm going to try, against my better judgment, perhaps. And is there a chat for me down there? Is this show chat previews? No. Okay. I'm just worried I'm going over time. What this is significance. Okay, so this is not like, it's not like these plots here don't tell you anything predictive. It's just purely descriptive. It's just what you've observed in your sample. There's no statistical significance here. This here is based on significance. So when you've got a color in the box, it's significant. Now, how to read this? The top, this is the last result slide. The top row is English. All of this is English. This in the bottom row is Russian. All of this is Russian. It's hard to see because I have this thing in the way here, but this is cause, this is metaphor, this is responsible, and this is language. So these are four metaphors. These are the container, this is fire, this is fluid, and this is the object metaphor, manipulable object. Is it something you can hold? So each one of these boxes is the combinatorial possibility, potential. The bigger the box, the more frequent it is. The bluer the box, the more surprising, significantly surprising it is, if you like. So we see here 4 metaphors in 2 languages with 2 dimensions of the profile of use. How to read this? This is English, we go along the bottom row. here, it's self. So when you, the person who speaks, is responsible for the thing that is making you angry, you're to blame. You're angry with yourself. This is significantly associated with British uses of the fluid metaphor, the fire metaphor, and the container metaphor. Completely contrary to Russian. In Russian, you don't use the fluid metaphor or the fire metaphor, it doesn't even occur, or the container metaphor if you're angry with yourself. In contrary, in Russian, you use the object metaphor if you're angry with yourself, especially if the cause is sadness or jealousy. So here we have a difference in the profile of how, very detailed difference in the profile of how these metaphors are used in the different languages. We go to another row here. This is the second row from the bottom. And this is when this is when the person responsible for what has made you angry is somebody you know, usually a family member, your wife, your husband, your sister, somebody like that. When it's somebody who knows responsible, in English, you use the fluid metaphor or the fire metaphor or the container metaphor. You don't use the object metaphor. Where in Russian, it doesn't happen. None of them are significant. So here, this is a characteristic of British use, which doesn't exist in Russian. And we can go through again, opposite. Here we have when it's stuff in general, okay? Then these are the metaphors you use in Russian, where in English you don't. So we're getting a picture of the different metaphors and how they're used in the different languages and cultures, a behavioral profile of the metaphoric use. Now, these differences are not huge. They're subtle but specific, but this is based on statistical significance, which means that they are generalizable. It's important to remember that we're using a highly specific group, it's a highly specific text type, personal diaries generally written by young women, so we can only generalize to that. If we want to find out if this is true for the entire Russian culture and the entire English culture, we'd need to replicate the study using different types of data. But we know we can do that. That's the advantage of quantitative analysis. We know the limitations of the study. This is true for the type of data we looked at. We can now try and replicate it with different types of data. So, conclusion. Problems. There are some analytical and fundamental limitations of using the behavioral profile approach to look at abstract concepts, idealized cognitive models, these sorts of things. First of all, it depends on manual analysis of natural examples. The fact that this is subjective is often criticized. I don't actually think that's such a problem, okay? Traditional linguistic analysis is subjective, and we're doing it hundreds of times, and we use statistics to help us determine the predictive accuracy of our analysis. That's not such a bad thing. But often the problem is that because you can't search a corpus for a concept, we have to use different types of ways of getting instances of concepts. And this can influence our results massively. And also, even if we do it manually and read a text looking for concepts such as epistemicity or metaphor source concepts, it's very, 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 very subjective and difficult to do. So the actual getting the data is a real analytical problem. I don't actually think the subjectivity of the analysis is such a problem. I think the actual sampling method is really a difficult issue. It's an analytical limitation. It can be improved. We can develop heuristics to deal with this, but it is a serious one. And I think the biggest thing, the most important limitation I want to finish on is it's frequency-based. Now, some people who believe in the usage-based model believe it's frequency determined. I think Joan Bybee might actually believe that, but almost everybody else knows that the usage-based model is not purely frequency-driven. Just because something is more frequent does not mean that it is more important. It often is, but there's also the weight of the instance. Not every instance in your life, every time you hear a word, it doesn't have the same input in the system. Every time you use a construction, it doesn't. So we know a priori that frequency is not the only variable that determines entrenchment. It's frequency and salience or other things, okay? So we know that it's an imperfect operationalization of grammar in the mind. Pure frequency on its own is an imperfect, well, pardon me, most of us believe it's an imperfect operationalization of grammar because it's not only frequency that contributes to entrenchment. And if you're using corpora, you only have frequency. That's an inherent and massive limitation, in my opinion, and I don't know any way around that. So, pardon me, it's great because it gives us patterns that emerge from the data, the quantified analysis of qualitative analysis, quantitative treatment of qualitative results analysis. We get significance. We know the generalizability of our results, and we get accuracy. We have ways of testing hypotheses and calculating the descriptive and predictive accuracy and adequacy power of the models, the concepts that we're analyzing, which is the aim. And I think it's very possible despite all the problems that we have. So thank you very, very much. Is anybody still with me?
Yes, Dylan, thank you so much for this thought-provoking, inspiring talk. Actually, we have over 200 participants with us online tonight. So with your talk, we presented a full picture of the behavioral profile analysis. For instance, why do we need this approach? And more importantly, how to conduct behavioral profile analysis in our research. I think your study of anger is very refreshing, especially it is a lacto variation analysis, right? Because you explore the metaphor of anger among different languages and compare them. What's also very important in this talk, or what's impressed me most, is the main statement that grammar results from usage and it is determined by patterns that emerge from that usage. So I think we need to bear this in mind when we conduct a behavioral profile analysis. So before we go to the questions from the audience, Thomas, do you have any questions? Or do you have any comments?
I really appreciate the behavior profile. So what is your motivation for choosing the language? Why American English, British English, and the language of Czechoslovakia and Russian? Is it just depending on the availability of the speaker?
No. I mean, it depends on the availability. It's my interest, my areas of interest. I work on Slavic languages a lot. So there's a bias towards that because they're the languages I've studied. But it's also the availability of the corpora. That's it. English is a pain. I find English very personally, I find it quite a boring language to study. But you know, you study it because it's good for communicating. If I'd presented, I don't know, some other obscure language, people would have not wanted to listen. But it's actually very difficult because English is a world language. So getting corpora is very difficult because how can you tell whether it's a native speaker or not?
Okay,
so I would actually say, so I actually think that actually it's availability of corpora or the ability to develop corpora which determines it more than anything else. But yeah.
So I was wondering what is the topic area the behavior profile is most good at? Is it only good at discriminating the synonymous words and not good at longer patterns of constructions? Can I understand in this way?
I think it's equally good at discriminating or rather predicting lexical choice and grammatical choice. So I think both synonymy and grammatical alternations have been demonstrated to, I think it's equally applicable to both of these things. The question is it applicable to the more wishy-washy things like metaphors and stuff? That's the challenge. I think whether it's grammatical construction or lexeme, I think it's equally applicable. The problem with grammatical constructions is what is a grammatical construction? And I've worked on that a lot, and I'm personally, I think of constructions as actually clusters or emergent patterns themselves. But that's a topic for, well, next time I'm giving a talk with you guys, I believe. So somewhere.
Okay, yeah. So
if
yeah.
if you're talking about constructions in the traditional sense of construction grammar, then I think that both then the behavioral profile is equally applicable to both.
So I think it is equally valid for the analysis of diachrony.
Well, I mean, statistically, diachrony is more difficult for two reasons. One, the sort of statistics you need to use there is ordinal, and so it's just technically more difficult. For example, the motion charts that Martin uses. Well, actually, it's all he does. I mean, it's not a criticism, but they're just snapshots in a row. Yeah. So there's no actual diachronic analysis. It's the interpretation is visual. That's a good thing, but that's a way of avoiding the problem of ordinal study. So actually, if you're going to do predictive modeling of diachronic research, it's actually very difficult. The other problem with diachronic is it's not really ordinal. It's continuous. So how do you determine your periods? What criteria do you use to determine when you talk about change? Do you let the data decide when you talk about like one period of language or a next period of language, or do you try and do it continuously?
Yeah,
These are analytical problems. They're not theoretical problems. It's just technically how are you going to do that? It's a level of statistics which is non-trivial.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the lecture is easy to follow, and I think the audience will benefit a lot. Okay, Selina, can we turn to the questions from the audience?
Sure. Thank you, Professor Dylan, and thank you, Thomas, for your involvement. Professor, we have two questions from audience in the chat. One is from Yang Zhixia. She or he asks about how do you think the applicability of BP approach to the analysis of metaphorical expression, especially in political discourse?
Okay, so I think there's two parts to that question. I have applied behavioral profile. I often and frequently apply behavioral profile approach to critical discourse analysis and political discourses. Okay, I have several doctoral students doing this, and in my own research, I've done it as well. So the answer is completely applicable. However, metaphorical expressions in political discourse, that's more specific again. So using behavioral profile approach to look at political discourses, it's fine. I can send you a bunch of studies doing this. My doctoral students would probably love to speak to you. But if you talk about metaphorical expressions in political discourses, you're probably going to have is frequency, because metaphors are actually not that common. I mean, they're common, but they're not that common. So you'd have to look at a lot of political discourses to get enough metaphors to do quantitatively. Because if you have, it's a problem of what's called type token ratio. If you have, for example, you identify 12 different metaphors in your political discourses, you really need to have like 50 or 60 examples of each of those metaphors. And if you are looking at, for example, contrasting left and right wing politics, or I don't know, two magazines or two types of interviews or something, then you have to double that because you need to have it in both. And that's a lot of political discourse to read. Now, if you are able to do it using keyword, this is one of the things I avoided discussing in the talk, was this problem between continuous analysis and keyword. So sort of retrieving some examples of metaphors by using keywords versus reading the text and manually looking for instances. I expect with this, you would have to read the texts yourself. And there's great software for doing this. Actually, some wonderful software developed in China for this. But there are online annotators. There's free cross-platform annotators for this, where you just read and you just highlight, okay, instances. It goes very quickly, but you have to read it all. And to get enough metaphors in political discourse, yeah, it's doable, but you'd probably want to zoom in on a couple of metaphors, and that may not be the goal. So again, a practical limitation, not a theoretical or technical one. Just how much time do you have? But if you want to discuss it further, I can, and I can send you instances of that.
Thank you, Professor Glynn, for your very detailed answer. And here is a follow-up question to this question. That is, how did you identify the metaphors? Which criteria did you use from Fang?
Okay, so that's the weakest part of that study by far. That's a very good question. And what we did is we identified figurative instances. We sort of did that separately. And then we had a column. Well, we didn't have a column, it wasn't Excel, but we had a cell, and we put the word that was responsible, or the expression that was responsible for us thinking it's a metaphor. Why do we think that's a metaphoric example? We put that word in a box, right? And then we exported all of those words to a list. And then we tried to categorize them into semantic classes. Each one of those semantic classes is a source domain. Some of the words didn't fit any semantic class. They didn't fit any semantic sets. And those we left as, those we left as just ad hoc metaphors, not conceptual metaphors. Most of the items, happily, it was easy. So I don't know the number, but like 2/3 of it was like, okay, yeah, that's anger is a, I don't know what, wild pig or something. But then there was a lot of them, which, yeah, we were just, I don't know. One of the problems is that neither me nor my co-author are sort of metaphor experts. So we were also a little bit, yeah, in the dark there. So we need to develop, and that's one of the things I concluded there with, we need to develop heuristics, better ways of doing that. That's, I think, the single weakest point in the study.
Thank you. Another follow-up question from Daiying from Zhejiang University. She asks about how do we resolve disagreement between different annotator? Are there better approaches to minimize the subjectivity in manual annotation? Actually, this is a very common question when we do corpus-based analysis, especially when we do the multivariate analysis. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, yes. So, I mean, I could give a whole lecture just on, I could give a whole series of lectures just on qualitative annotation. There are lots of different heuristics depending on the type of variable. I hinted at a couple of them there. So one of the nicest ones that I like is the use of granularity. So is that the term that you use, granularity? Is that transparent, what I mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
So the number of distinctions you make. So if you design your coding schema so that, and this is true for an ordinal, right? So I gave an example of a Likert scale, of a scale of 1 to 9. So two coders coded independently of each other, very subjectively on a scale of 1 to 9. They will never agree on a scale of 1 to 9. You reduce that to a scale of 1 to 5. So 9 and 8 become 5, 6 and 7 become 4, etc. Right? So you reduce the granularity. You go from a scale of 9 to a scale of 5. Then you may get inter-rater agreement. If you don't, you go to a scale of 3, and then they always agree. Well, almost always. So that's one way of doing it. But you can also do that for nominal categories. Is that a term you guys are familiar with? So ordinal is on a scale. Nominal is like apples and pears and bananas, okay? So you can also do that. One of the best ways is when you start your annotation schema, start with a lot of distinctions, but make sure those distinctions are subdivisions of other potential distinctions. So, what's an example? It's often difficult to distinguish epistemic from evidential verbs or something, or cognition verbs from some other type of verb, all right? You're trying to classify verbs. So you start with both distinctions, evidential and epistemic, but you know that you could clump them and just call them stance verbs, right? People expressing opinion. Right?
Yes.
You express opinion, right? So when you do your kappa and you see that the level of agreement between the two coders is quite low, you drop it down a level of granularity. You get rid of the distinction of epistemic and evidential, and you just go to stance. And then usually you get a level of agreement. So you use the kappa not as a way of determining who's right or wrong or what to do, but what level of granularity your analysis is reliable. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you start with many levels, many different levels in the statistical sense, many different categories, but you know a priori, you've decided before you try to apply those categories that they are all subtypes of some other category. And you have the two annotators annotated a high level of detail, lots of distinctions, and it won't work. But then you drop it down a level and you use the kappa to determine, yeah. So that's, if you actually look at coding schemas as they're presented in computational linguistics, that's normally how they're presented. Okay, I can give you some references. I can send you the links of how we do this, especially with appraisal. Type that here, appraisal. I don't know if you guys are familiar with appraisal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very important, appraisal. I'm currently working with a team in Germany trying to train ChatGPT to do appraisal analysis. And this level of granularity is essential. Yeah.
Wow, that's very innovative, I think. We're looking forward to the
If it
output.
works, if it works. Oh,
Mhm.
one article's nearly out, but yeah, I can send it to you when it's done.
Thank you. A question from Dr. Meng Qinglan. He asks about how did you decide your sample size? Is it dependent on the number of predictors and their levels?
So sample size is determined by practical concerns, how much time we have. So how we do it, how I do it anyway, at least with my fellow colleagues, is we say, okay, how do we have enough time to analyze 1,000 examples? Okay, how many different things are we going to look at? Let's take 1,000 and divide it by that. So if we're going to look at 8 lexemes, and we've got time to do 1,000 examples, take 1,000 divided by 8, and that determines the sample size. Obviously, that's not ideal. But that's the reality of the situation. Sample size that if I'm guessing the implicit question there is how many examples do you need to do the sort of things we're doing with the predictive modeling? That's a question as a statistician I get asked all the time. The answer is it depends you can do a logistic regression analysis with 80 examples, but it will be a very simple logistic regression analysis. So it's not your sample size, the more complex your question, the more different variables, and especially the number of levels each variable has, if they're nominal variables, That determines your sample size. So it depends how many variables you want to look at. So if you may have noticed in my results there, sometimes I would have lots of variables together. Other times I would only be looking at two. So you would see a plot and it would be intensity and responsible. And the next plot would be intensity and cause. The reason I've done it like that is because I don't have enough data to put all three things in together at once. So I have to do two separate studies. It was the same with some of the predictive modeling. Like with the last plot, the mosaic plot, I only had enough data to look at two things simultaneously. So I needed more data. But I just didn't have the resources.
That's very clear. Another question from Dr. Xu Mengming. She asks about how did you classify the responsible type? What criteria do we base on when conducting classification in specific research? For instance, should we anticipate or presuppose distinctions among lovers, family, and friends in advance?
Yeah, this is the subjectivity of the analysis thing. As I said at the end, it sounds like the weakest element in these sorts of studies, but in reality, it's not, because it's determined usually by, well, no, there's two things normally that determines the choices you make. One is previous research. So we're almost always replicating some traditional analysis or some previous study or something like that. And so we take previous categories. The other is the topic of discourse. So what they're about. That, for example, in this instance, we didn't take what the social psychologists, the categories they'd used. We didn't take those ones because our data was all about, well, basically, there were teenage girls talking about their love life, right? That was the topics that these diaries are about. Okay, it was boyfriends and stuff at university. So we had more fine-grained distinctions than they would have in social psychology. So in a very ad hoc way, we modified the coding scheme to match the type of data we had. To answer your question, I think the question that is implicit there is eventually or ultimately you let the data decide. So we will often have sort of 4 or 5 different versions. Okay, so we experiment with different categories. And very quickly, in practical terms, it's clear which ones are informative and which ones work. But you can keep them all and you put them into the statistics and it's immediately obvious which categories are necessary and which ones are not. So it's sort of data-driven. So it's this combination, both top-down and bottom-up. You sometimes have inherent, predetermined, well-established categories which you apply. And then in other times, you really don't know, and you experiment, and the data will help you decide. Does that sort of answer the question? I hope.
Sure. So after this question, we have one from Vanessa. And because in today's lecture, you present the case studies, which is a contrastive analysis between different languages. So this participant, he or she asks about, can we apply this approach to research of a single language? I think the answer to this question is definitely yes, right? Because at the very beginning, you introduced that actually most researchers, they use BP analysis to analyze between synonyms or synonymous constructions. So we may do this kind of research within one single language, right?
Well, actually, the first results I gave were entirely language independent because we were trying to replicate what the psychologists are interested in. So they're not interested. They're not, for them, language is a random variable. For them, they want to identify universal structures. So the first, it happened to be different languages in there, but that information was removed. So the first plots, I assume I will send you the plots that people will be able to download or whatever. The first plots, I mean, it happened to have different languages in there, but they could have been of a single language. It's absolutely.
Yes. Then we have two questions from Professor Wu Shuqiong. Actually, she is from Sichuan International Studies University, and she is a pioneer in introducing and applying the BP analysis in Chinese. She first asks, how do we decide on the words of the emotion when we use the corpus-based behavioral profile approach? Some scholars use the nouns while some use verbs or adjectives.
Okay, so I spoke about that a little bit in the talk. It's a very complex topic, and it's one that I personally feel quite strongly about because I think it's an excellent question. I think it's one of the if you're looking at metaphors specifically, I think it's the single biggest problem. If you're looking at translation studies, it's also a big problem. So I'm currently doing research on Chinese and French using the BP approach for translation work. Not translation, equivalence. So I think it depends on specifically. So you're saying, how do we decide on the words, the emotion, when we use the corpus? Yeah. To what ends? To describe metaphors, to describe lexical structure, to describe cross-linguistic equivalences. If all three, what can you give me an example of the application? Because this is a big topic and I don't want to talk for 2 hours about the answer.
I guess because in Chinese, when we talk about emotion, there are some words, some nouns can express emotion, but also there are some adjectives which we use to express emotion.
Okay, so yeah, but like in every language. And so if the thing is that if you are okay, if you're a cognitive linguist like me, we believe that the construction or the part of speech here is part of your choice. So you start with the concept, right? The ICM. And then you choose to profile that concept, to construe that concept in different ways. And so one of the first parts of your choice is what part of speech, noun, verb, adjective, you choose to construe that concept. Now, the issue is here that the language will have, so Wierzbicka, okay, argues that differences between cultures and languages can be found in their preferences for construals. So for the fact that in Russian, you typically talk about anger as a verb, and in English, you typically talk about anger as an adjective, and in French, you typically talk about anger as a noun, in Wierzbicka's understanding, says something about the cultural difference. So that's one dimension to your answer. You need to look at all different things depending on what you want to do. The other side is that if you're interested in metaphoric stuff, metaphors tend to be associated with nouns. So that's maybe a good reason to only look at nouns. But if you're a cognitive linguist, you want to look at all of them because they're all part of the choice. They're all part of the construal. If your idea is to understand the concept and how it's represented. If you're just interested in the lexical semantics, so my PhD looked at trying to find a way of applying a coding schemas across different parts of speech. Now, the problem you have is that if you have different parts of speech, some variables will not be relevant to different parts of speech. So how can you compare an adjective and a verb, for example? Some of the results you will get won't tell you anything about the meaning of the words you're interested in. They're just telling you about the grammatical categories that they're profiled in. Okay, so one of the problems I had in my PhD is I found that nominal profilings were more abstract than verbal profilings. Well, that's not very interesting. So if you talk about anger as a noun, as opposed to anger as an adjective, then you're going to have more abstract meanings of anger associated with the noun, and that's trivial. It's just because it's the noun. It's nothing to do with anger. So these are big questions, and I'd like to discuss them more. I just don't know. There's so many, your question could be a 2-hour lecture into answer is what I'm saying. So if you want to give me more information, then I can be more specific. It's such a, that's a rabbit hole. That's a big problem. I always look across parts of speech because I'm a cognitive linguist, unless I'm looking at metaphors, and then I may only look at nouns.
Thank you. I guess maybe in the future, when Thomas will hold the forum, the CAFCL forum, he will consider invite you to give us 10 lectures on cognitive linguistics and corpus linguistics methods. Thank you. So one final question: if the frequency of some types of emotion metaphor is very lower, fewer than 5, what do you usually deal with this when you do statistical analysis? Actually, in my study, I also the same question, that is sometimes the data is very skewed. So so I need to go back to the collection phase. Maybe I need to add more corpora as my data source, and this is very complicated. So how do you deal with this?
Okay, so again, excellent question. It's and a question we all are confronted with. The first step is that often you just omit them and you report, you say, we call it data sparseness. Due to data sparseness, there are only 5 occurrences of X. We haven't included it in the quantitative stage of our analysis. Future research needs to blah, blah, blah. That's just, you know, we have so much time. You can't always go back to your corpus and la, la, la. So omitting things which are relatively rare is totally fine. Quantitative analysis has its limitations, and you need, well, but what you can do, of course, is leave them in and use statistical techniques which are not skewed by differences in frequencies. So for example, those correspondence analyses I gave you, I left this information out because it was too much detail. It will try to counterbalance, try to negate the effect of different frequency on the results. And it gives you a measure, the mass, of how much it had to bias the results to unbias the results, if you like. So that's one thing, but that helps a lot, but it doesn't solve the problem. The other thing you can do is to, as you said, supplement your data. Well, that means going back to the data and getting more examples, and that's ideal. But it's not always possible.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you again for your wonderful lecture and your contribution to cognitive semantics. And at this moment, we also want to thank all the audience for participation, and we encourage you to continue to follow and support this series of lectures. Join our talks, ask questions, and promote this series among your colleagues. Your involvement is welcome. So at last, Professor Glynn, would you like to say any final words for us to wrap up?
Sure, absolutely. If any of you, am I sending you the slides or I don't know what? I mean, I have my email address on the slides and also some links. If you have questions, don't hesitate to email me. And it's fine. I'm pretty busy, but if I don't answer, just email me again. I will get to your email eventually. I don't know how will that work? Should I send? Is there a link or?
You mean your email address? Actually, I add your email.
You add my email address to the profile or something? Okay.
Yes, we will also post this video recording on COSE's WeChat platform. So maybe tomorrow the audience will have access to your video recording, and they may write to you when they have questions or they want to communicate with you. Is that okay?
Well, if you want, I can put the slides online on my website, because looking at slides in a video is a pain, especially for specific details. So I can put the slides up on my webpage, and you can get my webpage from the video without any problems, or just email me with any specific questions. So
thank you.
I don't really,
okay.
Thank you. It was a great honor, and you guys were great. I wish I could have seen you. to know what was going on. But really good questions. Every question was spot on. It's really, really reassuring to know that at least, well, that people understood me, because the questions show that absolutely it was every question was exactly one of the problems that I was either avoiding or trying to explain. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.